He was a Christian, but he killed his imperial father-in-law, then his imperial brother-in-law, then his own biological son, and possibly his wife. Later, he killed his own imperial colleague, another brother-in-law, along with his nephew. He persecuted Christian minorities, destroyed Greek temples, and prohibited sacrifice. But he had no problem with people praising him and even venerating his statues. He was the very first politician to make Sunday a holiday and to offer tax benefits to churches. Of course, I'm talking about the Emperor Constantine, who called himself the Conqueror, and whom history sometimes calls the Great. He certainly did something great, or at least impressive, when he changed the state religion of Rome from polytheism to Christian henotheism. And during the 13 years of his sole rule, Constantine effectively overturned 1,000 years of religious tradition. He convinced a traditional society that ancestral and indigenous forms of worship were incorrect. Catholic Christians of Constantine's time praised the emperor to the skies, but many Christians today see his reign as the corruption of Christianity, when the Roman state and the Christian church became part of a single system, when all the backstabbing and jealousies endemic to politics infected the Holy Catholic Church, which forever lost the right to be called holy in any plausible sense. I'm Dr. David Litwad, and if you enjoy free scholarly content, I hope that you will subscribe to this channel, check out my published books, and join my online school, the Gnosis Academy, where you will find loads of courses in the fields of Gnostic and Hermetic studies, the New Testament, and early Christianity. If you want summaries of scholarly literature, you can sign up for free on my website, the Gnostic Archive. All the links are in the description. Constantine was born in the early 270s in the city of Naissus, modern Niš in Serbia, and he died on the 22nd of May, 337. He was the eldest son of Constantius Chlorus. His mother was Helena, daughter of an innkeeper, who was also called a stable girl. Constantine's rise to power was due to the military successes of his father Constantius, who served as Caesar in the western provinces. There is no strong evidence that Constantine's father was a Christian. He served under an emperor who persecuted Christians, namely Diocletian. Although Constantius never killed Christians, he may have closed or even torn down their churches in obedience to the edict of Diocletian. Constantine was the first Christian emperor, but he was not the first person to legalize Christianity. That measure can be attributed to the Emperor Gallienus, more than a dozen years before Constantine was born. In the year 260, Gallienus had granted churches the right to own property. Since that time, Christianity was recognized as a lawful religion, although Christians were not preferred or promoted by the state. In the year 303, the Emperor Diocletian decided to persecute Christians. For the next 20 years or so, the policy of persecution was followed, generally and sporadically, by Eastern emperors like Galerius, Licinius, and especially Maximinus Daia. Constantine was an insider, active in the imperial court between the years 303 and 305. He wasn't a child during this time, but a man of about 30. And during this time, he did nothing to stop the persecutions, and he never spoke out against them. At this point, Constantine may not have been a Christian. If he was a Christian already, he chose to say nothing about it. Of course, any high-profile official who confessed Christianity at this point risked losing their job, their property, and their life. Constantine escaped the Eastern court and became Caesar in the West in the year 306. For the next 6 years, he fought foreign enemies near the Rhine. But in the course of time, his powers and ambitions grew. In the year 310, Constantine and his army saw what appears to have been a solar halo in northeastern France. Apparently, this halo split the rays of the sun into a cruciform shape. Initially, Constantine interpreted the event as a sign of victory under the protection of the sun god Apollo. At the time, he was near the temple of Apollo Granus. Constantine had stopped there to make some sort of vow. A Gallic orator of 310 offered the following description and interpretation of the vision. Quote, "The success of your affairs prompted you to carry out what you had vowed to the immortal gods at the very spot where you had turned aside toward the most beautiful temple in the whole world, or rather, as you saw, to a god who revealed himself. For you saw, I believe, Constantine, your Apollo, accompanied by victory, offering you laurel wreaths, each one of which conveys a portent of 30 years. Later, either in 311 or 312, Constantine became convinced that his divine protector was not Apollo, but the god of the Christians. Presumably, he was influenced by the opinion of Christian leaders who were welcome in his court during this time. 30 years later, Constantine told Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea, that the cross appeared above the sun with an inscription, "By this sign conquer." By this time, the mature and victorious Constantine was mixing in his own interpretation. He understood the sign as a command by the Christian God to make war on his non-Christian enemies, who just happened to be fellow Roman emperors. Constantine started to use the Chi-Rho symbol as his own personal talisman and protective charm. At some point, he put the Chi-Rho on his soldiers' shields, though this may have been fairly late in his career. Constantine's entire army thereby became a force for Christian violence, that is, violence done in the name of and under the protection of Christ. With new religious confidence and a thirst to attain political dominance, Constantine fomented 3 civil wars. The first was against Maxentius, his brother-in-law, who controlled Italy and North Africa. Constantine beat Maxentius in the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Before this battle, Constantine had already issued legislation in favor of Christians in the West. In 313, he had no real power in the East, but after the battle, he persuaded or compelled his imperial colleague Licinius to allow Christians freedom of religion and to restore confiscated property to Christian churches. Churches even took over the property of Christians who had died during the persecution with no heirs. In 313, Constantine still had 2 imperial rivals, both of them staunch upholders of the traditional Greco-Roman cults, namely Maximinus and Licinius. Licinius did the dirty work of defeating Maximinus. Now, Maximinus was the most bitter enemy of the Christians. In fact, as he was about to engage Licinius in battle, he made a vow to Jupiter that if he won, he would utterly destroy the name of Christian. But as fate would have it, he was defeated, retreated, and committed suicide in Tarsus. The emperors were now reduced to 2, Licinius and Constantine. One might say that Constantine then stabbed his co-emperor in the back, for in the year 316, Constantine launched his own war against Licinius. He was unable to defeat Licinius outright, but he did gain control of northern Greece. Then in 324, Constantine made yet another unprovoked attack. After an important naval battle led by his son Crispus, Constantine beat Licinius not far east of modern Istanbul. Before he defeated Licinius, Constantine advertised himself as a protector of Christians. He did not try to hide his Christian identity, and he did not confuse solar monotheism with his own worship of the Christian God. Constantine had a deliberate policy to protect and to promote the Christians in his domains, and his imperial opponents knew this. In fact, Constantine wanted to promote himself as a liberator of Christians from the so-called tyranny of his political opponents. When he began the war in 324, he presented it as a virtual crusade on behalf of Christians in the East and himself as liberator of Licinius's Christian subjects from persecution. Ironically, Constantine himself was a persecutor of Christians, just not the Catholic ones. In November of 316, he issued a law that Donatist churches in North Africa were to be confiscated by the government. And this same government in North Africa started killing Donatists who resisted in the year 317. For Constantine, the sponsorship of Christianity was very selective. It was the Catholic Christianity. And he used Catholic Christianity to attain political and ideological unity. He had no toleration for other Christians like Valentinians, Marcionites, and Novatians. He called them all, quote, opponents of the truth, enemies of life, and counselors of ruin. Everything about you is contrary to truth. He forbade their churches the freedom to assemble in public or in private. He confiscated their church buildings, including private houses in which these churches met, and he gave all this property to the Catholic Church, which was now a wing of the state. According to Eusebius, the sacred books of these alternative Christians were hunted down and destroyed. This would explain why we have so few copies of other Gospels and no copies of texts like the Marcionite Gospel. As for traditional Greco-Roman religions, Constantine chose to tolerate them prior to 324, his final victory. He was politically savvy enough not to make enemies among traditionalists, especially those at Rome, but he very quietly began appointing Christians to fill important administrative positions. In effect, Constantine filled the Roman administration and top military posts with Christians whom he preferred for their loyalty. In the words of Eusebius, quote, his ministers and servants, dedicated to God, men distinguished by the most reverent and virtuous lives, were made guardians of his entire estate and his faithful bodyguards. After crushing Licinius in 324, Constantine did not tolerate non-Christian religions in any robust sense. Indeed, he selectively suppressed them. According to Eusebius, he roundly condemned traditional forms of worship in what he himself called shrines of falsehood. He prohibited the making of new cult statues, the consultation of oracles, and all animal sacrifices. In 325, he made it a capital crime to possess a copy of Porphyry's book Against the Christians. He cleared out all the traditional Greek and Roman temples of Byzantium, mainly to allow for the construction of new churches in a refurbished city called by his own name, the city of Constantine, or Constantinople. Essentially, he wiped out the city's pre-Christian memory. This decision was stunning and wasteful because the previous city of Byzantium had recently been renovated by Licinius, but Licinius, of course, was Constantine's enemy. Constantine gained money to build his new city and many large churches by raiding the temple treasuries of non-Christian deities. The statues of gods were stripped of their precious metals and returned to their priests as wooden husks. In the words of Eusebius, Constantine did not think he needed infantry or a large army to refute these errors, but one or two of his nobles alone were sufficient for the service, whom he dispatched to every people, and these proceeded amid populous nations and folk, and through all cities and provinces to search out the persistent error, ordering the priests themselves with great laughter and scorn to lead their gods into the light from the innermost darkness. Stripping them of their outer trappings, they revealed to the eyes of all the hollowness inside the painted surface. Then, stripping off what seemed useful of their material, they tested it in melting pots and fire. Of the valuable part, however, much was deemed necessary for them to take intact. They laid away in a safe place and kept, while what was superfluous and useless they left as a memorial to the superstitious worshippers. From a Hellenic perspective, Constantine engaged in temple desecrations by stripping the cult statues of their precious metals. He sent special envoys to tour each province in the east and to scour both cities and the countryside for objects of value which could be melted down and turned into coin. They tore the doors and roofs off temples for the metal that they contained. They ordered the custodians of Hellenic temples and shrines to produce their gold and gold plated statues. They took the gold and melted it down. Statues of bronze they simply seized and removed in order to adorn Constantinople. In this way, many cult statues survived, but they were transformed from objects of worship into mere decoration. Apollo was placed on the streets of Constantinople. The Muses were put in the palace. The statue of Fortune was called a barmaid, since she was placed next to a tavern. The poet Pallidus joked that the Olympian deities could escape being turned into coins by living secretly as Christians, that is, by adorning a Christian city. The god Eros, or Cupid, was not so lucky. A bronzesmith made him into a frying pan. To quote the words of Eusebius, Constantine went after the heroes fashioned of bronze, and when even these gods of hoary myth were captive, surrounded by braided rope and led away, Constantine decided to demolish an entire temple and precinct in the mountains of Phoenicia. This was the temple of Aphrodite, which Constantine ordered to be demolished to the foundations, with all its statues destroyed. And to accomplish this, he sent out a military force. The worshippers of the love goddess were powerless to resist. Constantine destroyed another shrine of Aphrodite at Heliopolis, aka Baalbek, and he destroyed the temple of Asclepius in Cilicia by his private army. Asclepius, who appeared to people in dreams and healed their bodily ailments, was too close a competitor of Jesus, and this particular temple was associated too closely with Apollonius of Tyana, who taught there. Constantine seems to have had a particular vendetta against Venus or Aphrodite, who was technically a state god of the Romans and mother of the Roman hero Aeneas. In Jerusalem, Constantine ordered Aphrodite's temple to be dismantled, and he even dug far into its foundations because the Christians claimed that Jesus' tomb lay underneath. In the words of Timothy Barnes, the building and beautification of Constantinople was funded by a massive program of confiscations. Constantine suppressed cults and their shrines, which Christians considered immoral. Constantine also suppressed oracles which had encouraged Diocletian to embark upon his policy of persecution. The priest of Apollo at Didyma was apparently tortured. The sacred tripods of Apollo at Delphi, the statue of the god and the serpent column, were confiscated and taken to adorn the new race course in Constantinople. Moreover, Constantine destroyed the cult site at Mamre in southern Palestine in order to construct a large church there. He ordered that the cult statues be burned and the altars crushed. Then he cleared the site because he considered it defiled by idolatry. Constantine promised to severely punish anyone who attempted to re-establish their traditional practices at this site. At Alexandria, Constantine disbanded the priesthood of the River Nile, possibly executing the priests themselves. It's hard to deny that Constantine had a genuine sense of his mission. It was his divine task to convert the Roman Empire to Christianity. He couldn't destroy all the traditional temples, but he could put them out of business simply by defunding them. He ruined the roofs of some temples by taking off their metal coating. Damaged temples had no funds to renovate and no way to cover basic operational costs. In this way, a religion dependent on temple rites and sacrifices could quietly die. Hellenic and other indigenous religions were expensive and based on practice. Once practices like sacrifice were defunded, the public veneration of the gods, including past Roman emperors, fizzled away. Constantine initiated a policy of systematic donations to the Christian church from imperial funds. Churches were empowered to feed the masses based on tax dollars. Priests and bishops were relieved of their civic duties. Constantine gave them literal bags of gold to build new churches in major cities. He gave the bishop of Carthage, for instance, 3,000 bags of gold, which contained over 500 pounds of the precious metal. But this was only 1/5 of the amount that he sent to the bishop of Rome. He presented the Church of St. John Lateran in Rome with 2 near life-size statues of Jesus made of silver, 4 silver statues of angels, silver statues of the apostles, numerous gold and silver chandeliers, liturgical goldware and silverware, and silver candlesticks. According to later traditions, the gift totaled more than 1,100 pounds of gold and more than 11,000 pounds of silver. Constantine similarly endowed the Church of St. Peter at the Vatican. All this money was called from taxes paid by people throughout the empire, most of whom were not even Christian. Constantine even wrote to the bishops that if they needed any more money, they should write to the local governor in order to receive it.